Hello neighbors, it's Brad here at eTrailer, and today we're taking a look and installing the Roadmaster Diode Wiring Kit on a 2017 Ford F-150. Now this is going to be available in a few different configurations. On the wiring itself, you're going to have bare with no connector, a 4-pole, as well as a 6-pole. Now as far as your umbilical connection, you're also going to be able to get that in a straight cable, a coiled cable, as well as a hybrid cable. Now there's 5 main components when flat towing a vehicle. And the first one, we'll start off on the vehicle side, is going to be the base plate. And the base plate is where you actually attach to the frame or the bumper supports of the vehicle, creating a sturdy mount for your tow bar to attach. And that's going to be our second component. The tow bar creates the connection point between the towed vehicle and the RV. You're also going to have your diode wiring, which is going to transfer the turn signals, running lights, and brake lights, as well as sometimes 12-volt sources from our RV to the towed vehicle. And that way people behind you know what you're actually doing when you're turning and braking. You're also going to have your safety cables here, and just in case of an accidental disconnect, that's going to make sure that this stays attached. Now, if a catastrophic disconnect happens, you're also going to have your supplemental braking system. And what that's going to do is going to slow and stop the vehicle when the brakes are applied on the RV, but you also have a breakaway switch here included with that braking system. So if that disconnect happens, it's going to pull this pin, applying the brakes on the vehicle. That way it's not rolling down the highway. Now when you flat tow your vehicle, it essentially becomes a trailer behind your RV. And just as a trailer would have trailer lights, you're going to want to do the same with your vehicle. That way the people behind you know what you're doing. Now many times you can get magnetic lights that stick on the vehicle, but on a truck like this it's not so easy, and that's really just one more component to have to tow around and hook up. Once you have your diode wiring installed, you'll see it's going to mimic the lights, the running lights, the brake lights, and the turn signals of your RV, so that way when you plug in, you're ready to have your lights working properly. Now those signals are transferred from the RV with our 7-pole here going back to our 6-pole mounted here on the vehicle. So really a lot of this installation is just making sure we tie into our taillights with those diodes and running our wiring up here to make that connection. Now, as far as installation goes, it's pretty simple to do. You are going to be tying into your factory taillights, and you just kind of make a few quick splices with some Spade connectors, and you're going to run some wire up to the front. But we're going to take a look at that and get your diode wiring installed. Now if you've installed your base plate, you want to make sure that you leave that bumper off. It makes running the wires quite a bit easier, and when you mount your 6-pole, you're going to actually need to feed the wires through the bumper and then attach it. So having your bumper off is going to make the wiring a lot easier to not only run but also mount up. To begin our installation, we're going to start by taking our spool of our wire, and we're going to just put it at the front here. I'm going to leave myself just a little bit of extra because eventually we're going to be tying into our 6-pole. Now we're going to be routing this back to the taillights, and part of this is really just making sure that we're not making contact with anything that's going to be moving, such as suspension or drivetrain, or anything hot that can damage the wires. So I've gone ahead and actually ran it through this frame rail. And the way I did that, I just took some Airline tubing that I had extra of, but really you can use anything that's something to feed this wire through. And really the reason I did this is because to route it over, I really couldn't find a nice way to do it, and putting it in the frame rail means that it is protected. So you can kind of see that I fed it through here. So I've actually routed it through here, and I've just put a little bit of wire loom just to kind of protect those wires from rubbing against any of the metal. And throughout the rest of it, I've really just used a lot of the factory wiring harnesses or loom, or even some of the brackets for the brake cables to attach it. So I've pretty much just routed it on the top of the frame rail and brought it over here. And this is going to make it easier on you because you're not going to have to be completely under. You can actually just kind of follow where we have our brake line brackets. Now don't zip tie it to the brake lines. Those are hard lines. You don't want those to get damaged. So using the brackets here, there is an opening to put your zip ties. So maybe every foot or whatever you deem necessary, any turn, throw a zip tie on there just to kind of keep it on there. Now at this point in between the frame rail and the fuel tank, you can kind of see I routed it here, went over this center support, and then just following again that wire loom here, made my way to the back. Now you might notice that I only have 2 wires here, and the reason being is our brown and yellow are going to be going to our driver's side tail light. I've peeled back the white wire quite far, and I put a ground screw into the frame, and we're going to see that kind of back a little bit. Just kind of right before the fuel tank, I mounted this up. The reason I peeled that white wire back is to gain quite a bit of extra wire, as we're going to be using that to jump over to our other taillight. So having that extra white wire makes it a lot easier than having to extend wires. I also split my green wire over, and I kind of just ran it in this little spot here, using the actual holes as well as some of the wire loom there to attach it. And then I have it just kind of hanging on our passenger side, because this is going to tie into the passenger light. So now that we have these split up and we have our extra white wire from that ground wire, we can start putting our diodes in. So now we're going to need to remove our tail light here on the driver's side, and this is going to be an 8mm socket to get these bolts out. And then our tail light should come out fairly easy. Sometimes there's some clips that will hold it in, so a little wiggling back and forth allows this to separate here. We've got a bottom clip here, and then what we're going to do is take our wiring plug here and just separate it from the tail light. And we're going to be tying into these wires, so what we need to do is actually peel back this wire loom as well as the tape. And I'm going to go back pretty far. It just makes it a little bit easier to get those diodes in place, and that way you still have movement to plug it back into the tail light. So I'm going to go ahead and get this all peeled back, just being careful. You don't want to cut any of the wires while doing this, but you may need to take a razor blade to kind of get some of this tape off. So I've got our insulation kind of taken off here, and what we're looking for is the stop and turn light as well as the running lights on here. And you can actually test it with an electrical tester here, just running through the light sequence and finding which pin it's in and the corresponding wire. But I've gone ahead and saved you that trouble. So the wires that we're looking for, blue, and there's a small gray stripe on there. And then we're also going to grab the gray with the orange that's kind of wrapped around here by this purple with orange. So I'm going to kind of separate these out a little bit, and what I'm going to do is make a cut right here on both of them, and that should be far enough back that we can get our diodes in easily and still have enough room to work around with our plug. So I'm going to separate this guy and unravel it, making it a little bit easier for us on both ends. So our diode's going to just kind of jump these together, but we'll need to actually put spade connectors on all of these ends. So I'm going to go ahead and strip these back a little bit. Now these are pretty small wires, so just take your time here. You want to make sure that you have nice and good contact. So we'll get all 4 of these stripped back. And then you can go ahead and grab a diode, and we're going to just take our spade connectors here off. And then we'll just go ahead and get our spade connectors put on all 4 of these. Now, since they are kind of smaller wires, something I suggest, if you strip it back just a little bit more and kind of bend the end, that's going to probably give it a little bit better bite when you crimp it down. You don't have to do that. I think it just gives it just a little more secure of a fit in there. So we'll go ahead and do that to all of our wires and get these crimped down. Now something else I suggest is when you do crimp them down, just give it a slight tug just to make sure that it's really in place, but also so it doesn't come loose over time. Just like that. So now we can take our diode that we've taken our spade connectors off, and we can go ahead and put the plug side here. This is going to be out. So we want to make sure that these ones plug into that single out. We'll take another diode and do the same here. And then just take the corresponding wire, and you can put it on either terminal here. It does not matter. So we'll just put our blue and gray with our blue and gray here. And then I'll do the same with our gray and orange. And at this point, we need to actually pull up our yellow and brown wire. So I'm going to go ahead and get an Airline tube. You can kind of use anything like a string or whatever to kind of reach down just to feed those wires up. You could probably do it by hand too, just seeing that there is an opening. So let's get these wires pulled up. So I have my yellow and brown pulled up. I'm also going to take my white wire and feed this down. And this is going to be a jumper wire for our running lights circuit. It's going to go over to the passenger. So I'm just going to pull this down, get all of our wires kind of the same length. So now I'm going to just cut off the excess wire that we have here, and I'm going to go ahead and strip all these back. And now this is where it gets slightly different. Our white, being the jumper wire, is going to need to go with the brown wire, and we're going to be using the yellow Spade connector. You're going to see that there's one of them, and it's just a larger diameter for the gauge of wire because we have two of them here. So what we'll do is just twist these up and put our yellow Spade connector right there. And then we'll put a blue on our yellow. So our yellow is going to be the left turn signal here. So we need to tie this in with the gray and orange. So I'll just go ahead and plug that in here. And then our yellow is going to go with our blue and gray here. Might get a little tight here. You can see just the Spade connectors there. So just kind of be patient. You don't want to break the diode. But once we have these all plugged in, what I'm going to do is kind of just tidy this up and also just make sure that there's no stress on these wires. So putting a little electrical tape before and after the connections, and then we're going to zip tie these up. Now there is double-sided tape here, so you can stick those together and kind of tie your wires in and then zip tie it up. Put a little bit of tape, and then that should be good. Now, to be a little bit more clear, it is a gray with brown wire here, not with the gray with orange, and you can see they're pretty similar looking. And the best way to make sure that you have the proper one is on your pins. While testing, you can find that the second and third pin are going to be the ones that we tie into. So double check that because they do look very similar, especially if you don't have proper lighting. So just make sure that it's these two that you're tying into. So you can see I've just kind of made those connections there and then just zip tied this up to kind of keep it from moving. So now really at this point we can go ahead and plug our taillight back in. And you can just kind of tuck your diodes kind of in this pocket here, and that way you can get your taillight back in. And then since we saw our wiring, our green running over already, we're going to route our white wire that we created as a jumper and run it at the same kind of the same path, and that way we make it over to our passenger side where we'll remove our taillight and continue on installation. Now, here on our passenger side, you're going to see we have our purple and orange wire. Now, there are actually two purple and orange wires, so you're going to want to kind of look here at your plug, and it's going to be your second pin. And there's also going to be the blue and gray that we're tying into. You're going to see that these are next to each other, so that's how you know you have the proper one. So just follow that wire and make sure that you're cutting into the proper one. From there, you'll make your connections. Your green wire, which is going to be your turn signal, goes to the purple and orange, and then your white jumper wire that you had for your running lights from the other side is going to tie into the blue and gray. Now with everything buttoned up, we can get our taillight back in. Now I did run a little bit of extra tape here, and that's because you have this little strut for the tailgate to drop down, so you want to make sure that that's not getting caught. There's also this clip here that goes onto the side. I suggest putting that in there, that way it's not going to pinch those wires. So let's get this back in place, and then we can head up to the front of the vehicle and we're going to get our wires attached into our 6-pole. Now up front, this is where we're going to be taking our wires and connecting to our 6-pole, but in order to do that, we're going to need to put our bumper back on. That way we can kind of get it fed in and we can mount up our brackets. But you'll see, this is our diode wiring. I also am doing a charge line on this vehicle, and that's something I suggest during a flat tow. You might want to throw this in, and what that's going to do is just give you 12-volt power, and it's going to charge the vehicle's battery while towing, and that way when you get to your destination, you're not having to jump your vehicle. And some of them actually have to stay in the accessory mode for tow mode, and that can kill the battery while going down the road. So now we're going to get our bumper back up in the reverse order that we took it off. We're just going to make sure that we feed our wires through here, and really what we're trying to do is get these studs started. There's also the studs on the bumper that go through that we'll be tightening those up, but if we can get these hand tightened, that's going to get us in a good position. I'm going to take my wires and just kind of feed them through where the base plate arms are located, and then raise this in place. And we're going to get these studs aligned here. So it does have a plate, and it's possible that these will kind of move on you. So you may have to push it from the back end to kind of get these to pull back up, but if we get a few threads on here, it's at least going to hold it in place. So I'm just going to hand tighten this one on. Now another thing you're going to want to make sure you do when putting your bumper back on is plugging in your fog lamps. So make sure you get those plugged in as well. As far as mounting up your wiring, your 6-pole here, you can kind of pick a few different places. In fact, it comes with a bracket. So if your state doesn't require a license plate, you can absolutely get away by putting it in the center here and mounting it up. But this one does have a front plate. So I've used this plastic cover here, and I've just drilled an 1¼ hole saw hole here, and that's going to allow us to put our plug in place. But we're going to need to feed the wires through, make that attachment, and that way it can sit on there. So what I've done is taken our boot and slid that on there. And I'm just going to slide this back a little bit here, and I'm going to go ahead and cut my wires back to the same length as my red wire here. Now again, you may or may not have that red wire if you have a charge line, but we're just going to cut this back and then separate our wires up. And I just peel back maybe about 2 or 3 inches here. That's going to make it a lot easier to just work with our individual wires. And then we're going to want to strip all of these back. So I suggest having a little bit of extra wire. It's going to be a little bit easier to make these connections here. I'm kind of working with what I got here, but we're going to make the connections on our little spots here, and you're going to see there is a small Phillips screw, and what I'm going to do is actually back these out. Now you don't want to take them out completely because they are kind of tricky to get back in, but as I open this up, it's just going to make a spot for that wire to go in, and this is what's going to hold that wire in place once we tighten it. And there's actually going to be corresponding letters that will say where these need to go, and so we're just going to be matching those up. So we have a GD for ground, an LT for left turn signal, an RT for right turn signal. We have TM for tail markers, and then we also have this center section. This is going to be for our 12-volt power supply, so that's going to be where our charge line goes. So I'm going to leave, there's an S here. We're not going to be using that here, so I'm going to leave that one closed up. The rest of them I'm going to open. And then I'm going to get my corresponding wires in here. So starting off, we can go ahead and put our ground in. So white goes to GD. And just make sure you have a nice clean end to put in there. And then once sliding it on there, you're just going to kind of tighten this down. Now you don't have to get too crazy here. You want it snug, but if you over tighten it can actually damage those wires. Okay, So now that I have them attached, I'm just going to run through the colors and the corresponding letters. So in the center section here, we have our red wire, and that's going to be this long one here, and that's just going to be our 12-volt power supply for that charge line. Now here I have RT, which is going to be our green wire, and that's going to be our right turn signal. LT is going to be our yellow, and that's our left turn. GD is going to be our white, and that's our ground. And then we also have our TM, which is going to be our brown, which is our tail marker lights. So now what I'm going to do here is kind of push this back in place. And then I'm just going to take a little bit of dielectric grease, and I'm just going to kind of put them here in the terminals, just kind of goop this up, and that's just going to help keep these wires having the longest life possible without breaking down. It's just a little added protection. Now if you need some dielectric grease, we actually have some here available at eTrailer. And then with our grease in there, we'll go ahead and get our boot on. So just slide that over. And then for another little added protection here, we're just going to put some electrical tape around this, and that's just going to create a nice seal. That way water doesn't get in there and break those wires down as well. So I have my electrical tape around here. Now I'm going to place my plastic back in, so it should fit really nice here. Now you might also see I have a hole cut here for our breakaway switch, and I've just mounted it to a bracket, and this is just going to allow this cable to pass through, and we'll be able to hook up to our breakaway switch. Now we're using an Air Force 1, so it's an air brake. I've also run our Airline over so we can put our fitting here. So again, if you don't have a license plate, you're going to have a lot of real estate to work with. Otherwise, this may be the best spot for you. Something else that I will say can help quite a bit is if these metal clips came off of the plastic and they're stuck in the bumper, you can pinch the two tabs and pull these out just by kind of squeezing them. They can be a little tricky, so if you need to get some pliers, you can. And you're going to want to get these on the plastic. It's going to make it a lot easier because there's teeth that bite into the plastic, and it's really hard to just slide the plastic onto it. So you're going to want to get these on. So I actually had to go back, pry these open to get them to bite on, and that way we'll be able to pop this back in place, because otherwise it's going to be pretty tough to get this to stick in nice and flush. So now I have this in place and it's pretty tight, but we're going to need to put our self-tapping screws here, and that's going to hold it in permanently, and then we can test to make sure our lights are working. So now we're going to test our lights to make sure that they're working. Now I'm using a test box, but you can actually hook it up to your RV and run it through the light sequence all the same. So starting with my running lights, I'm then going to swap to my left turn signal. Now I'll do my right turn signal, and then finally my brake lights. And that was a look and installation of the Roadmaster Diode Wiring Kit on a 2017 Ford F-150.